man right there. Without further ado, then, I would like to introduce our speaker for this evening with that note. And I'm so happy that Richard remembered what happened 22 years and 2 days ago, and it happened to be on a Saturday. More wonderful. Our speaker this evening is Dr. John Best, who is a specialist in sports and exercise medicine with the OrthoSports Group down in Randwick. John graduated from the University of Newcastle and then went to postgraduate studies in London University and has spent a great deal of time in the UK working in various roles within the world of rugby. He enjoys a number of clinical areas, in particular, rugby medicine. And he has been heavily involved in Australian Rugby Union for almost 15 years. He was the Wallabies team physician from 1994 to 2000, which of course put him in Cardiff that wonderful Saturday afternoon 22 years and 2 days ago. And his other roles also include at the medical sports science consultant in the high performance unit for Australian Rugby. And he was the tournament medical officer for the Rugby World Cup in 2003. He has represented Australian Rugby on the International Rugby Medical Advisory Board and Anti-Doping Committee. Wow, that's great. He has also, while he was in England, worked with the English Premier Football League with Fulham and Charlton Athletic, the Professional Rugby League with the Wasps, Bath, and Leicester Rugby clubs and the old London Broncos. In 2005, he was appointed the team physician for the victorious Southern Hemisphere Rugby Club. He is at present a co-adjunct lecturer at the University of New South Wales, where he teaches medicine and exercise physiology. John was awarded in 2000 the Australian Sports Medal for Sports Medicine by the Prime Minister and Governor General of Australia. He has also served as a medical consultant for the Australian Professional Golfers Association, the PGA. He has been nominated as a community leader by the New South Wales Police. He has served as Football Australia High Performance Committee on the National Rugby Medical Advisory Panel. I've known John since I have joined St. Mark's, where he has enjoyed a parallel career as the men's pastor within the church community. And let me say that I've been to more than one wonderful out of breath now talking about all of this.
Thank you, Tom, and thank you, Rotarians. Should I get started?
Yes, we're keen to hear.
All right. My wife, Megan, who was a Rotarian, is going to get my screen set up. And while she's doing that, she went to Wiggins, Colorado.
As an exchange
student years ago.
Beautiful.
That's all right. Keep going. It's mental health.
Okay, you should be able to see the slides.
Yes, perfect.
Good. All right. Well, look, it really is a privilege to be joining you tonight, and thanks very much, Thomas, for those kind words. And just for proof, this red box is a box that has a medal in it that Her Majesty the Queen gave me. I was one of 40 people years ago when Australia beat France in the Rugby World Cup final in Cardiff. We received a medal from the Queen, and I'm going to come back to that from the perspective of my own satisfaction and glory days. That's right up there. This is a topic that's dear to my heart, mental health in professional sports. It's partly because, as a health professional, how I seek to view the individual, body, mind, spirit. And what I'd like to do in this presentation is great. Is the second slide come up for you? Great. What I'd like to do in this presentation is go through a little bit of my background, but not a great deal because Tom has done that. And I want to introduce you to the world of the elite athlete. I then want to dissect health generally, in particular the connection between physical and mental health, and even bring up the concept of spiritual health. Spirituality has been studied in healthcare quite vigorously for the last decade or so. We'll go through some case studies, and then I'll explain and go through what the current research status is on mental health in athletes and what's being done to address some of the challenges that are there. So as Tom mentioned, I work as a sports medicine physician. I work with this group, Orthosports. We have offices in Sydney. And for a period of time, I worked for a group called Pure Sports Medicine in London. I'm one of those very fortunate people that has never had a bad day at work. I truly haven't. There's a lot of variety in what I do. So outside of my work over the years with elite sport, and these days I don't travel with teams anymore. I stopped that about 2 years ago. I do a lot of advisory work. So I work with the National Rugby League. I do a lot of training of doctors with our registrar training program. But I learn a lot and love just looking after my weekend warriors, the recreational sports people who just want to be healthy and do their best. But it has meant that over the years, I've had an opportunity to work with different teams, and that exposes you to different cultures as well. Different sports and teams have different cultures. When we look at the world of the athlete, it's very much a high performance culture, and there are parallels to business, in my opinion, and people who are in the public eye. But I think it's helpful to remember that we're dealing with males and females who really are very normal people. They're humans, but they live quite abnormal lives in terms of their travel and the demands on their world. And it's what's often described as a performance-orientated culture. That is, the way they work will determine how they're judged. And there's a bit of a problem with this in that you end up having, if you have a bad day, and it's not a good day to have a bad day, people will remember it. Their career may end very quickly. Their life is very highly structured. In sports, there's a concept of what's called periodization, and periodization is where you have a schedule for the year. So in business, it would be reporting seasons. With athletes, it's very much when is the big tournament that's on, when can you rest well, when can you train hard. So the people who live with high structure, and for most of them, it's good for them. But the life is very fragile. It can change very quickly. Injury, illness, not being selected, all these things can end your job forever. And the other thing that's unusual is with men and women, particularly through their late teens and early 20s, if they go on tour and travel with teams, or if they play individual sports such as golf, tennis, triathlon, it's very hard for them to have real friendships that develop over time. So if you go through that exercise of looking at who are your close friends, who do you lean on when you need help, who do you enjoy spending time with, who encourages you, many of these are quite long friendships that you've developed. But with athletes, they don't always have this, particularly if they're earning money. They tend to be thrown back into their world and be asked to be paying for their friends lots of things. It's very interesting. They end up with a lot of acquaintances and people who like to use them. People want to get tickets for them. Can you sign this jersey for a fundraiser, et cetera, et cetera. And built into this is this very fine balance between work and recovery, so training hard and being restored. And there's often quite a deep psychological burden with performance. So in my own work, I try not to have bad days, but I know there are some days where I may not be at my best, but I'll get through that. With athletes, once again, if you have a bad day when it's important, you'll get judged very heavily on that. Okay, so unfortunately the video is not working here. We'll go through things, but this is actually a video of an athlete who falls over as she's about to throw the javelin at a very big event. Thankfully she got up, but it's very tricky. So how are we wired and how do we function best? There's been a lot more discussion of late looking at body, mind, spirit models. Science and medicine historically has focused very much on the body, so physical illness and the things that contribute to how our physical body and our physiology functions, nutrition, sleep, and so on. Mental health became better understood predominantly through the 1950s and beyond that. But the idea of what gives you purpose and meaning, spiritual health, has now come forward as well. And the reason I've put this here is that with athletes, the identity they have is very much as an athlete. So their identity is the soccer player, the tennis player, the rugby player, and so on. But if that stops, and one day it stops, they're in a lot of trouble unless they have more meaning in their life. And that does impact their mental health. So in Australia, if we look at the statistics of mental health disorders in Australia, we know that in the last 12 months, 1 in 2 people did report to healthcare providers some sort of mental health disorder. And we know that 10% of people actually access formal care through Medicare services. But in the age group of 16 to 24, it's at least 26%. So 1 in 4 in that age group will report mental health distress. In older age groups, such as the 75 to 85 years, that's much less. With severe mental health disorders, such as severe depression, the strong connection there and concern is obviously the risk of suicide. And if you are in a family where that has occurred, I feel for you. It's terrible. It's so distressing when that happens. So we're looking at up to 15% of people may be at risk of that with untreated or severe mental health. And it's the leading cause of death in that age group in Australia, in the UK, and also in the USA. So when you look at what other diagnoses we're talking about that are prevalent, anxiety is at the top of the list, depression, and then there's a group of other disorders that may be behavioural or personality type disorders or other psychiatric problems. So within that group, you've got ADHD, you've got psychoses, you've got addictions, and you may have schizophrenia and so on. There's also an overlap between physical and mental health. So the people in the top 3 here are if you have back pain, sciatica, asthma. If they're chronic, they appear to be associated also with mental health problems. We also know that exercise helps mental health. So any form of exercise does reduce the severity of symptoms, especially anxiety, but in particular, resistance training and high intensity training. That's where you might exercise on a device like a bicycle and then have short stints where you go quickly. That works very, very well. So there's a tremendous amount of research on this, and it does appear that exercise does change the neurochemistry, so that, if you will, the happy chemicals are higher. And we also know that exercise allows people to sleep better, which has a very positive impact on mental health. So when we look at models of care within teams, and if you compare this to your own life, you and I hope at least you've got a good GP who helps look after you. And that GP may direct you to other specialists or other healthcare providers as needed. With the athlete, it's quite intense. So you've basically got a coach or manager who connects to a medical director of an organisation, the players in the middle who has their own doctor, and they're influenced by their trainer, the dietitian, psychologist, physiotherapist, and sometimes a chaplain as well. Can you still see my screen there? Yep, okay. So within a medical team, what do we do with athletes? Well, we take things a bit further. We look at what we call screening and profiling. So we often screen people head to toe to find areas that are weak or stiff or imbalanced. We try and correct problems that may lead to injury. But there's also now psychological screening that we do, various questionnaire surveys that are directed towards, in particular, anxiety and depression. And then we start introducing programs to prevent injury and maintain health. And there are lots of things we do that influence mental health: what we eat, how we recover from training and matches, how we cope with travel, and addressing psychosocial issues. Centres of Excellence started to develop in the 70s and 80s. So, for example, when I was a medical student back in the day, 1983, I was a medical student at the Institute of Sport in Canberra. I was one of the first students they had there. And that's really when I fell in love with sport and exercise medicine. And in these situations, there are now further residential care facilities where there may be academic support and a degree of mentoring. I've got 3 or 4 videos that aren't going to work here for some reason, but I'll go ahead. This is actually a video of Australia versus England. They're playing each other on the weekend, and normally you would see the England number 10 hurt his shoulder in a tackle, and it's mainly to demonstrate how quickly things can change. Now, one of the red flags we have with athletes, which may be a reflection of how they're going mentally, is what we would call off-field issues. So there are some athletes who tend not to get into trouble. So we've got Serena Williams here, who in herself and her family, she has business interests. She was incredibly successful. She had a big entourage that supported her. Who'd like to have a guess who this player is? Who are the soccer followers here? Okay, this is a French player called Eric Cantona. He was playing for Manchester United, and he used to have these rages of anger. And he walked off the field because he heard someone slander him from the stands, and he went and did this karate kick from the side. Anger, particularly in males, is a strong reflection of mental distress. It shouldn't be excused, but it's a pointer towards it. And Tiger Woods has had his challenges as well with addictions and the like. One of the most successful coaches I worked with in rugby union is this chap here called Rod McQueen. I had 5 years with Rod. One of the things he did very well is he let people on his team do their job. So he didn't try being the trainer or the doctor, and he was happy that we're all sitting on the right seats on the bus, as they say. And he was very insightful. And he used to have this saying, high performance requires a happy home. If players are not doing well off the field, they tend not to do their best on the field. And just because you're successful doesn't mean you're always going to be satisfied or happy. And I've been aware of, I've had the privilege of joining your group, I think 2 years ago, Dale and Tom. So I'm aware of the demographic. So many people will remember Boris Becker. So Boris was the youngest ever Wimbledon winner, And when he was number purpose in life anymore, and it's hard to find the right excitement to continue. And that's somewhat perplexing. And because he definitely was a very upbeat personality, and I've met the man. And this really was when he should have been at the pinnacle. But the point is, even in the most successful moments, it doesn't mean it's always satisfying. It is so unreal. It is so unreal. This player here I mentioned, who's passed now, I learned a lot from this man. And we're just going through a couple of case studies here before I get into some research and give us time for our Q&A. Papa Bouba Diop was a Senegalese footballer, a beautiful athlete. When I worked with the Fulham Football Club in London back in the day, and at that stage, and I'm not trying to name drop, but it just reflects how big the sports are. Fulham was owned by Mohammed El Fayed, who owned Harrods. And the supporters loved that man because he propped the club up and restored it. Papa Bouba's nickname was the Wardrobe because no one could get through him. He was a great defender. Anyway, he had an ankle injury one game. It just looked like a fairly benign, simple sprain, and he kept rolling and rolling and rolling and rolling on the field like soccer players do. And I don't know why soccer players do that. It's the men at least, but they do. Anyway, we had to take him off, and I examined him, and there wasn't much to find. And still, he got to day 5, day 7 post-injury. He still was on crutches. He couldn't walk. And I thought maybe we've missed something. So we got some x-rays and then an MRI scan, perfectly normal, nothing. Then we get into week 2. He's still limping around. Week 3, we can't believe it. And I speak some French, and we mainly communicated in French. He's from the Senegal. And I said to him, are you okay? Is there something you're not telling me? And basically, he had this fear that he would never play again. And I reassured him that that's not the case. He could play this weekend if he wanted. And I said, what is it you're really, really scared about? And basically, like many athletes from African countries and in other sports, we see this with Pacific Island men. They send a lot of money home. So they support a lot of people. And I discovered that Papa Bouba created a foundation which supported about 250 families, not people, but families, in terms of education fellowships, sports fellowships, and so on. So very, very generous. And I know many of you here do charity work and support groups financially, but it's not unusual with elite athletes, and unfortunately we don't hear enough of it. People depend on them. Their world is a bit different. So what I'm going to do, Tom, is just spend a few moments going through some research, which is quite current on high performance athletes, and then go through what's some of the current thinking on this. So this paper here, done by a colleague of mine, Lee Golding, it was published in a very good journal last year, the Physician in Sports Medicine. The title of the paper is The Prevalence of Depressive Symptoms in High Performance Athletes, a Systematic Review. And what they did is a systematic review, in case you're not aware, it's a review of large studies. So it looks at existing research, but it really analyzes the quality of them. And this was a review of 16 large studies, which looked at beyond 50,000 athletes over a long period of time. And they basically found that in up to 34% of athletes, depression and depressive symptoms were common, which is roughly the same as the general population. They used a particular tool for that. But then they found that the severity of the depression symptoms was higher in certain situations. So the more intense the competition, so the better you are, the more likely you are to have severe depression. Also, there's a connection with head injury, with concussion. And I am happy that this is recorded. It's a tricky area, but I really hope no one sends this to the media because this is still being looked at. But basically, if you've had 3 concussion episodes, you're more likely to have features of depression from time to time. Females tend to be affected more than males, especially in individual sports. And if you are recovering or in the middle of an injury, you're more likely to have that. And I suspect with an injury, athletes have quite an existential stress and crisis as to whether or not they're coming back. Oh. Now, another study was done within a rugby league cohort. So the previous study was across team and individual sports, Olympic and non-Olympic sports. This is very specifically an Australasian study in rugby league players. The title is Depression, Anxiety and Alcohol Use in Elite Rugby League Players. And what they found, and I know all the authors, in fact, in their study of 400 professional players, a very thorough study using different tools, they found that depression overall was less, but anxiety was very high and alcohol consumption was very high. Now, this then has led to more screening of athletes and more education on alcohol consumption as a way of handling anxiety. So techniques to handle anxiety are done and introduced as a habit, so better health tools. And what about head injury and mental health, which I've alluded to? I just came off a virtual conference last week with a group called the Concussion in Sport Group. This is a very, very interesting group. It's an international group which has representatives from sports like the National Football League, the NFL in the USA, the Basketball League in the USA, Baseball League in the USA, Canadian Sports, World Rugby. There's no, at this stage, soccer representation there. But this group creates, pulls together research. They create position statements, tools and resources, and 2 researchers, one from Harvard, Grant Iverson, and one from Newcastle, my old alma mater, are big producers there. Now, at this stage, the findings about long-term mental health symptoms and head injury, it's still unclear. It's unclear if repeat concussion leads to brain degeneration. It's a very hot topic. But what we are finding is people who are recovering from concussion and have short-term memory deficit have a lot of fear that they're going to be having early dementia. So there's a lot of fear around head injury now. So the way we address this is very important at this point. So one of the things I'd like to go back to regarding care is when we look at how do we care for elite athletes, well, it needs to be good basic care. That's the thing. What do I mean by that? Sleep. So you often have to teach people how to sleep. That might include having what we call power naps. So power naps are a 15 to 30 minute nap, usually in the afternoon, to give people some energy, and it does have restorative properties. We need to make sure their physical activity is correct, but they don't overdo it, this fine line between overtraining and not overtraining. Addressing the use of drugs and alcohol, and in particular around pain management. So many athletes will have pain at any time, but how they deal with that is important. So the use of analgesics, the use of non-steroidal anti-inflammatories, and the misuse of many of these have led to significant law changes in Australia. For example, codeine now is a prescription-only item, whereas you could buy codeine, for example, Panadeine over the counter before. The 2 areas we're looking at in helping athletes develop through often people who are called welfare officers, sometimes chaplains exist within teams, are looking at creative outlets and vocational direction. So doing things that are really different to their work, different to their sport. The creative outlets could be art or music. It could be something that what we call avocational, that is a different sport even. Gardening, growing things. And really putting on athletes' radar very, very early. What are you going to do next? That's important. Now, beyond this, spiritual care is interesting. And I think when I look at everything I've learned about the elite world of sport, and I get this, this medal out of this box that the Queen gave me, which is probably the most valuable thing that I have. And it's fading and it's a bit chipped because it comes out when I do talks like this. I think the what's next question, what am I going to do beyond my sport, is the big thing. I think it's very, very big as to what's next. So with that, I've always been in the practice of having an opportunity to ask athletes, have you thought about what's next? Have you thought about what gives you purpose and meaning? And spirituality and spiritual care in health, and my wife is a leader on this. She's done a doctorate on spiritual care in people who are dying. She's a palliative care doctor as well. And it's not just religious. It could be about family or other things that give you purpose. We just need to talk about it more. So one of the big way forwards, and the Canadians are doing this, is better recognition and screening, but strategies to improve resilience. So that ability to bounce back when you feel under pressure. And within that, it's having better self-knowledge. So we do know that if people can understand themselves better, how do they react to pressure? How do they handle adversity? They'll develop some tools to help them get through that. And as mentioned, there are many different people there. This very aggressive knee injury is just an example of what can happen if people have an acute injury, even doing their normal job. So as I wind up and I get ready to take questions, I very much would encourage this idea that athletes are normal people that live abnormal lives. They have a body, mind, spirit like we do. Their rates of depression is fairly similar, but rates of anxiety by and large are higher, which may be something that leads to more use of drugs and alcohol as a soothing measure. And improving athletes' awareness of who they are and their resilience is probably the way forward in their ability to have better mental health as they continue on their sports career. Thank you.
Wow.
John, thank you so.
Actually, you go, Tom. You go, Tom.
No. I was going to say, John, thank you so much. That was really inspiring and eye-opening at the same time. I guess it's because you think of athletes as being someone that you see on the field, you see them performing, and you never see much about their personal life except maybe when something goes crazy wrong and you sort of say, why do they do that? Because they appear to have everything. So having said that, I'd like now to open up the questions to Pete. I'm going to ask you if you would mind moderating this for the Q&A from the floor towards John.
Yeah, sure thing.
If you'll just raise your hand, you can do that in the upper right by clicking on it. We'll be sure to get around to you.
So, Bray, I think I saw you had a bit of a question. So if you just unmute yourself and ask away.
I had a feeling over a few years ago when I used to employ a lot of people, in terms of money they earned, their behaviour with drink was different. A mechanic, for example, would have 2 beers and he'd go home. a high earner would have more and get into trouble. I wonder whether the sheer money that the top performers get that is not really channeled, they're not put into any particular business or fund, brings them to showing off and spending too much on booze, and it seems to bring a lot of them undone without knowing much about it. That seems to me. What's your feeling on that?
No, I think, sorry, I've missed your first name.
Ray. Sorry,
Ray.
it's my wife's computer. I'm not normally
Okay.
Maria.
No, thank you, Ray. I think it's there is truth there, and there are films with this, and there was a film with Tom Cruise years ago, Jerry Maguire. It's about remember that one? It's very well made, actually, very, very true. And there's a real arrogance that comes with wealth. It doesn't matter what industry you're in. The thing that's a little different with athletes is they do know that alcohol will affect their recovery from injury and their performance. And these days, if you don't turn up to training the next day, or if there's a scent of alcohol on you, you're penalised for that very heavily. So there are other drugs, though, that are involved these days. So that the stimulants, for example, that are there don't affect performance as much. They are not always expensive, but again, they're a form of escape as well. I think arrogance is another issue. I think humility in athletes is a beautiful thing. There was a man who played for the Wallabies called John Eales. I had his photo up, who was captain. Very down-to-earth, gentle man who was always surprised he could play rugby because it is an aggressive sport. So I think looking at character development is very important in athletes, but your point's well taken.
So you're of the belief that the clubs are doing enough to look after them, or they just give them the money and they lose it if they don't perform? They're under pressure to do that all the time. We see reports of them go to a pub or a club and being as full as fools. It's a bit of a worry, I think. And another one, in the olden days, people weren't earned as much, but they were always supported to get another job. They were learning. Well, Rothmans, for example, employed heaps of sportsmen when that was fashionable, and lots of pubs become publicans. They were trained on the way to their role after sport.
Yes. So where that is developed, and it hasn't been very good overall, is the role of the agent and access to personal development services. So the better agents will have a contract arrangement with their client. So let's say it is a rugby league player where they're paid, there's a limitation of how they access their money. So their money is given to them almost like an annuity,
Yes.
a certain amount each month. And built into that is an investment system for that, whether it be, say, personal property or buying into a business. And everyone knows in town who the better groups are and who aren't, because it takes a lot more work to set that up. I think in terms of who's responsible, I think it has to be shared. I think it's a combination of the national sporting body, the club, it's a joint employment contract, and the player has to take responsibility themselves. That's important.
Yes. All right. Thank you.
Thank you.
That's Thomas.
John, could I just build on that? There was a question about kind of substance abuse versus alcohol and finding that release, or that's a way to kind of escape the world. How is that being handled? You know, is it about kind of finding that vocational activity like gardening that they can sink themselves into to kind of divorce them? How is that being handled?
Look, if you say to a young man who is used to going out with his mates and having a night out that you've got to replace that with gardening, you're not going to get very far. Okay. So where I'm going with this is we try and help the players, irrespective of how mature or immature they are, young or old, try and get them to go through what their goals are. So if their goal is to have a full career, which in the rugby league, you'll only play at the high level, the average is 8 years. It's short. So the better players can play into their early 30s to mid 30s possibly. It's very much the what's next question. And if the what's next question is, look, you know what, I was planning to be a plumber, or I wanted to be a school teacher, or I want to have my own cafe, then you get the ball rolling with that as well.
Right.
Now, with regard to behaviour and drug use, there are contractual limitations for them, and you'll have players every year get their contracts torn up, and it's a sad thing to see, but that is the nature of that world, particularly if they're repeat offenders and have just chosen not to take responsibility for how they're going to behave off the field. One thing I enjoyed when I was with the Wallabies is we did do community service. We would have at least 2, 3 or 4 projects on the go, and the players would be involved with that, usually with one of the staff. I always was able to find hospitals players could visit, requests for visiting someone who's seriously ill. And look, Rotary is really about service, so I don't need to tell you the benefits to the community of serving others as well to yourself. I think the psychological term is altruistic egoism, feeling good by helping others. I've seen that written.
Yeah. Great, thanks, John.
Thank you.
So Dale, I think you had a question, and then Chris will come to you after that.
John, thank you very much for a really interesting presentation. And knowing you, you spent a lot of time researching that, and it was very, very enjoyable and successful. Our friends tonight, 3 of them are here, and myself, are great Wallabies fans. So apart from learning about mental illness, we love to hear about the Wallabies and certainly their success. So thank you so very much. Just one question aside from your presentation tonight. You were, and I'm sure you've finished a wonderful book which would be interesting to all of us on men's health. And I don't know if that's been published yet or if it's going to be, because we would really be interested in reading that. If you could just give me a quick update on that, that'd be terrific.
Dale, thank you. Gracious as always. Thank you. It's like I have a little fan club there, which I appreciate. I'm very passionate about men's health because healthy men help create healthy societies, Dale, is one of the messages. Also, I think it's a tricky time for men. We know that men don't have a regular GP like females do. So 80% of women will, less than 20% of men will. So I started a book which I thought I'd finished, but I had it. So the title is Man Health, Strategies to Live Well Through the Seasons of Life. And it is this body, mind, spirit style, but it's all evidence-based. So the 2 areas I had to add was immune system fitness, extra on dealing with isolation and disappointment. And I had a couple of medical friends review it, and my section on prostate needed to be enhanced a little more as well. So look, I'm hoping that I will be disciplined and finish it by the end of this calendar year. There is a publisher that's shown some interest in the concept and has seen some of the material. And if we get it out there, I hope it's a blockbuster, because I really do believe, for many reasons, men aren't viewed well in our society at the moment. And I think a healthy man is more likely to contribute well to society and enjoy his life better.
Yep. Yeah. Thanks, John. Thank you.
Thank you.
Chris, we'll flick over to you, and then over to you, Richard.
John, apologies that I can't turn on my camera. It's a technical issue.
Hi, Chris.
But look, you've discussed concussions, and from what I have understood so far, it is pretty much proven that a certain level of concussions really have major impacts long term. And when you look at what happened be it in cycling, be it in equestrian, you could see 40 years ago, no one really wore a helmet. these days, you can't really see anyone without a helmet when it comes to these sports. So why, and it seems to be very severe when we look at rugby. Why don't they make it mandatory to have head protection?
Thank you, Chris. It's a good question. So I've actually been involved with headgear research. We published papers looking at headgear in professional athletes and also teenagers. The normal headgears that you see in rugby league and rugby union, the AFL, what we call a soft headgear, there's no evidence that they reduce the rate or severity of concussion. They do reduce lacerations. And there's actually some evidence that if you use it in teenagers, it makes the sport more dangerous. So we did a study of 15-year-old boys, and they thought they were bulletproof when they put headgear on, and they would use their head as a battering ram, and the risk in play increased. The hard helmets that are worn in American football certainly reduce concussion rate. That is a completely different style of play. When I go to my meetings with NFL people, they just think we're idiots, that we don't wear helmets. They don't understand it. What's been interesting is the work in rugby union. So the international rugby body is called World Rugby, and they've been tremendous researchers in the last decade looking at diagnosing concussion and introducing law changes. So frequency of head injuries and concussion have reduced significantly in rugby union. So most big matches you see, players will be sent from the field. There'll be a lot of video analysis of it. So I think aesthetically, the answer to your question is no one wants to wear hard helmets. And from a safety and scientific perspective, we do have a belief that if we can minimize the frequency and the severity, the brain can recover. So plasticity in the brain is a big thing, brain recovery. What you're alluding to regarding degeneration in the brain is a condition called CTE. And if you like your sports films, the film Concussion with Will Smith is magnificent. It's basically a documentary movie with an African background neurologist who moved to America, and he uncovered a lot of the research in American football around concussion and head injury. So there's definitely a group of people that will have chronic brain injury, but the research doesn't remove what's called the variables. So your genetic profile, your use of alcohol, other injuries, and so on. So the direct link between sport and chronic brain injury still isn't there yet. The question usually someone asks me is, if I had a teenage boy, would I let him play rugby union or rugby league? I'm not sure. I'm not sure. We know that heading the ball for girls in soccer is not great. So we're on a very, very steep learning curve. And I think in 5 years, so not long, I think we'll have a lot more information. Good. But it's a good question, Chris.
Thanks, John.
Thank you. Richard, we'll go to you, and then Thomas, I think you're after that.
Yeah, thanks, John. Very interesting.
Thank you.
I'll start off with a statement, and I'd like you to comment on it. The reason that we're not doing that well in rugby over the last few years is that all the mums won't let their kids play rugby. They want them to play soccer. Would you like to comment on that?
So thank you, Richard. When you look at the success of national teams, they have done a breakdown looking at participation rates and where teams are in their ranking. And in my time with the Wallabies, and when we won years ago in '99, Australia was ranked #1 in the world for its success in relation to its player participation. So in the UK, particularly England, and in South Africa, there are huge playing numbers. Now, there has been a shift. So AFL has been very, very attractive to families. So the way AFL work is that once you have a family member who's registered, your home gets an AFL ball and you're part of the family. It's a bit like a church. If someone joins a church, you get given a Bible. It's a little bit like that. And in that early age, late primary, early high school, there's a fair bit of safety in the AFL and the same in soccer. What happened though is we had a real explosion in Polynesian background players and to a degree Indigenous who've made up an increased proportion of rugby players. But participation rates in the cities has definitely come down, but not in the country. So I personally think we're going to have more exposure to country-based players, but we're still going to have a smaller participation number. Soccer is interesting. You know, soccer is definitely the world game. It's huge. Families, immigrant families have got a huge interest in soccer. So European, Latino, parts of Asia, it's huge. And I don't think the football codes should compete. I used to be fairly protective of rugby in that regard, but I'm in my 60th year. I turned 59 not long ago, and I'm trying to write a men's health book. I'm really interested in people being healthy and enjoying their sport and activity. And I think within that, if you can ensure that it doesn't lead to violence off the field, it's important as well. You had a follow-up, Richard?
Well, no, I was just the comment on the fact that mothers tend to not want their kids to play rugby. They see it as too dangerous and try and talk them into soccer. But is there any indication? I have heard people say that actually rugby doesn't have the injuries that soccer has. I mean, soccer has a lot of leg injuries. Would you like to, can you comment on that, or is that?
No, I can. It's a good question. So when we look at injury data, injury surveillance, and just like we've done with COVID, we've got epidemiologists who look at injury patterns in the community and data. Through to about the age up to about 13, injury rates across all the football codes is basically identical. Then from the age of 13 to 15, soccer is safer than the football codes. Then from 15 upwards, it's pretty similar between rugby league, rugby union and AFL, and soccer remains low. Now, when you look at, and that's for all injuries overall, if you just want to look at serious injuries, so injuries where you require ambulance transport from a game, surgery, or head injuries, it's much the same. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thomas, I believe you had a follow-up question.
Yes, thank
and then
you.
Warwick will go to you.
John, as you're probably aware, in American gridiron football, the NFL reached a settlement with the players' union where, I'm doing my memory now, there was a $672 million pool created to help players live with and recover from the effects of concussion, CTE, and head injuries. Now, as I understand it, that $672 million sounds like a lot of money, which it is. But last year, the commissioner earned $120 million, meaning that the NFL is such a money generator that they're able to put together a pool for the players' benefit. And I understand that one of the focal points of the upcoming players' negotiations is they want to essentially double that pool because they have found that the effects of head injury and CTE has been undiagnosed and so profound that they simply think that the amount that's been set aside is immaterial. One more point. The NFL changed the way that they play, head spearing is out now. If you are someone who makes contact with your helmet, you can get fined and ejected from the game. Now, my question is this. The NFL has recognized the problem of head injuries and has created a separate fund for past players to deal with that. How is rugby, soccer, and AFL, which has essentially the same problems, going to deal with that issue?
It's unclear. It's unclear. It's each sport has its own medical retirement policies.
Mm-hmm.
And my own personal view is, and players know this, that we need to be far more transparent about the risks that are being taken, and people choose to take it.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
Because non-published surveys of athletes indicate that up to 90% of them will keep playing even if they are told there's a high risk of you having a chronic brain problem. I mean, at one level, they love it. What else are they going to do? So one could say that's very short-sighted and it's a burden on the healthcare system and things like that. I personally think it's going to be clearer, as I say, in about 5 years. I think with the NFL, the Players Association do want a bigger cut. I don't blame them, but they don't want the game to stop.
No.
Mm.
No.
So you sort of can't have everything. You can't have everything.
I suppose it comes down, John, to the question of how do we protect the athletes against an obvious harm without basically impeding or destroying the basic character of the game? I mean, if there is an assumption of risk.
Okay, so I can answer that. So Rugby Union, World Rugby is again a leader there, where they've been able to look at load and impact. So they've got so much data measuring contact points. So built into mouth guards, there are accelerometer devices. Built into headgear, there are devices. And then you've got video analysis. And then you've got eye tracking tests that are done when people are injured. And long story short, rugby's been able to work out what is safe to do during the week of training and what has to happen regarding changing law. And I think it's really doing very well in that regard. So this concept of, can the brain take any injury? And if it can, what is safe? And so we're getting a bit closer there, getting a bit closer.
Great. All right. I think maybe we'll just go to Warwick for one last question before maybe, Thomas, you want to wrap up for the evening. So Warwick, over to you.
Yeah, thank you. John, wonderful talk, but I'm just wondering what's in your back of your mind about your post-life after all your sports medicine life. What do you think you might do? And I was thinking about you when my wife goes and sees Dr. Angus Bathgate down,
yes,
which I'm sure you'd know of.
Angus was my registrar years ago. He's a nice chap.
Yeah, he is. You know, I just remember seeing all these rugby jumpers all around the rooms. Yeah. But what do you think you're going to do?
Thank you. Well, look, I've been very fortunate in that I've discovered that I like people, and I'm a committed Christian man, and I've studied theology. And I actually had a period of 4 years where I did a parallel career. So Tom alluded to this. My wife and I spent time at a church, an Anglican church at Kirribilli Church by the Bridge, it's called, St. John the Baptist there. And they were stuck. They needed a men's pastor. and I had done training at a Bible college at Croydon, Sydney Missionary and Bible College. And basically I did both. I did my medicine part-time and my pastoral work part-time for 4 years. Then I discovered I wasn't very good at the pastoral work. I don't think I was quite patient enough. Maybe it was my season of life then. But I think long-term, I think I could still be, I think I'd like to stay involved with healthcare as a tutor. I love anatomy, so anatomy tutoring. But separate to that, I think I'd be a pretty good hospital chaplain. I think I'd like to do that. I won't be retiring. I'll be transitioning, I think. And it depends what else is happening in our family and things like that. But I rarely get asked that, and I do appreciate it. I do appreciate that.
Thank you.
Great. Great question, Warwick. Thank you, John. Thomas, I might hand over to you to kind of wrap us up for this evening.
Okay. Thank you, Pete. Don't believe for 1 minute that John is not a wonderful pastoring person. He is soothing. He is calm. He's just the kind of guy, if I were in a hospital, I would want to be around. I mean, he says, it's interesting. He views himself as not being particularly good as a pastor. I can tell you someone who has been around him. He's terrific. And you can see from his general demeanor tonight, he's the kind of guy that you want being your doctor, your physician, your pastor. So, John, I'm just encouraging you to rethink your own evaluation of yourself. It's just not there. I mean, you're good at whatever you try. And thank you again for coming and sharing with us some of your thoughts, some of your researches on what is a very, very timely issue. It's been a wonderful pleasure having you again. And we've got 17 people who have tuned in tonight, which have all benefited. And I want to thank all of the people who have joined us this evening. It's wonderful to have you. And we will conclude our meeting tonight, 15 minutes late, but it was sure worth it, by reciting our four-way test. So Pete, if you'll put that up on the screen, and I'll ask everybody if they will mute themselves, and I will lead us in the four-way test. And what I will do is I will speak it and then give you a chance to repeat after me. So what we're looking at is the Rotary four-way test that we say at the end of every meeting, which is our principle and what we live by. So everybody mute, and here we go. First, is it the truth? Is it fair to all concerned? Will it build goodwill and better friendships? Will it be beneficial to all concerned? To Rotary, Australia, and the Queen. And let me say that our four-way test was right on with the body, mind, and spirit of exactly what John talked about this evening. So thank you, everyone. Thank you, John. Thank you, guests. And we will see you next week. Our speaker will be the Reverend Matt Wilcoxon, who is the head of St. John's Community Services. I just want to remind you that our club has been supporting Rough Edges for years, and Banksia Women, which is also part of the St. John's Community Services. So those of you that want to stay around and visit, you can. Those of you that want to leave and sign off, you can. And again, John, thank you so much for joining us this evening. It's a pleasure to see you again, and it's always instructive having you address our club. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Peter, too. Thank you.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. Good night.